Today, there are 1.6 million African American quilters in the United States. Quilting is an enduring part of our American history and is almost as old as the history of our country. From quilts made after emancipation and migration to urban areas during the 1920s, there is significant history of African American quilts being a valuable part of American history, art, and culture. Today, African American quilters celebrate their art with a strong African influence. This art combines with just as strong an influence in traditional quilting. With our modest exposure to a limited number of quilters in Washington, D.C., we were able to view their work, see their styles, and participate in the camaraderie among friends, sharing an art form almost like family. Quilting in the past 50 years has been recognized as an art form. Quilting is a form of self-expression, and it provides clues to the African American past. As Roland Freeman, a renowned photographer, quilt historian and collector, said, "Quilts are much more than something to keep you warm." Today we see the blending of traditional patterns with African American patterns and fabrics. The traditional story quilt is a fine example of a traditional quilt incorporating uniquely African American storytelling pattern.
When you look at a quilt as a piece of art, you see the stories that are told. When women, typically women, sat down and quilted, they shared stories with one another. They talked about their lives, their struggles, their ambitions. Seniors are a very, very important part of our constituent base. They are our history. They are the history of this city. And what an awesome opportunity we have in supporting their history.
Nostalgia suggests that the history of African American quilting was a craft practiced by slave women or rural women. The truth of the matter is that the 1.6 million African American men and women quilters represent a very diverse group of people.
My early childhood was spent in Nigeria, and it was a part of our curriculum to learn how to create art using fabrics and quilting, and it was a form of storytelling, and it was passed down from generation to generation.
I think it's a way to keep seniors involved, and I think it's important to keep seniors involved. The knowledge, the wisdom, the stories that they have. I'm amazed at how they are able to share these stories.
At the Senior Wellness Center in Southeast Washington, we met Alice Foster and several of her friends.
The name of our group is the Sociables, and we meet at the Washington Wellness Center on Alabama Avenue. Most people think that quilting is hard, but it is not. You just have to have patience. You have to read. The YouTube is a good example to find out how to do things and ask people questions. And it's nothing hard about it. It's enjoyable. Most people do traditional quilting, but you learn that first, and then you can go out of the box and do whatever you want to do.
Alice Dove values the community that is formed among quilters.
The fellowship that comes about from being with a quilt group like Daughters or our other groups that we meet with at the Senior Citizen or the Senior Center or the art group that we meet. It helps bond us, it keeps us together. We have challenges within our quilts, we have problems we have to solve, but we have other ladies and a couple time gentlemen. You know you can go to them, at least our group. Nobody is selfish, everybody shares, everyone's open, and it's just a wonderful sense of, I would want to say community, but it's a type of family that we have.
Karen Love quilts every day. She has a family history of quilting. Karen's story tells what has happened to so many of our quilts.
My inspiration for quilting came from my grandmother and my aunt who raised me. They made quilts, but they made mostly utility quilts to keep you warm in the winter. My grandmother used to go to something like a quilting bee where old ladies sat around the table and they quilted on the same quilt. And my grandmother, they were old, in their late 80s, when I saw them, I went visiting with her to this lady's house to quilt. And then, of course, they would sell it to someone, normally of the other race, and they would pay such a little bit for all that fancy work. They did crazy quilting, and then they embroidered around each piece. It was simply gorgeous, and it was normally out of silk material. So that was the inspiration for me. And then when I left home, my grandmother gave me a quilt. And when I got married and moved, of course, I had my quilt in there, but I was young and didn't have sense enough to protect it, so the movers stole my quilt, because of course they could use a quilt to protect other moving things.
Camille's story quilt is about her family.
This quilt was made by my sister. I have 5 sisters, and she made each one of us a quilt like this. Now, the importance of this quilt is that this is like a family quilt. This piece in the middle is from a dress that I wore years ago. Also, this was a blouse. This is my father's pajamas. This is our tablecloth. This is my mother's house coat. And all the rest of them are pieces of my sister's clothes. And she made each one of us wall hanging. One thing about this quilt, my sister, she put all the pieces on this laminated piece, and it tells what fabric belongs to which person.
The quilt exhibit at the Hill Center was so rich and finely done that we felt it important to meet the artist. Sandy Barrett Hassan began quilting in the 1970s by making crib quilts for her daughters and friends.
I made a couple of quilts for my kids, just to pass down, to pass on to them. I was born, I think, in the greatest era of recent American history. I mean, that period of such tremendous activism, such tremendous optimism that my children knew nothing about. And, you know, all of the younger generations know nothing about. And I wanted some way for them to know what I was about at that time, but also to have something that they could hold on to, that they could keep, that could last through the generations, to know about that period in American history. It's the process that's fulfilling. My quilts, for example, are always sort of like the finished work is a reference point for the next piece. There's some lesson in this quilt. I've had to learn something, and hopefully I've learned it. It might have to do with color, you know, it might have to do with technique. In terms of its commercial value, you never, ever can get back what you put into it.
Sandy graciously introduced us to her friend and quilting compatriot, Linda McKenzie.
Quilting is important also because we're handing down things that we've learned from our foremothers, our grandmothers, or great aunts, or whatever. We're passing those things along to the younger generations. Even though we may be doing it differently than they did, we still embrace that art of quilt making. I discovered that quilt making is a reflection of your personality. And sometimes you may be in a certain mood when you're making a quilt. And that comes out in your work.
Sandy and Linda are members of We Be Quilters, a guild celebrating their 10th anniversary this year. There are at least 20 members, and they have a waiting list for membership. We Be Quilters is a gathering place where new and seasoned quilters can teach and learn new techniques. Quilters at the Senior Wellness Center, individual fabric artists, We Be Quilters Guild, all keep quilting history alive and well.
I have to do it. I cannot not quilt.
I quilt 24/7.
when the world is going crazy, you can always pick up your quilt.
Fabric sometimes has a life of its own. Sometimes I try to make it be rigid and it won't.